Hello, everybody. Welcome, historic baseball fans. It is Jeff Cougar Koslowski from the Henry Ford's Historic Baseball Program, and I am joined once again by our researcher, historian, ballist, you name it, he does it, Marcus Razorback Dickson. Marcus, thanks for joining back up with me again.
I'm looking forward to talking about the tournament.
Yeah, we are all looking forward to the World Tournament here. The World Tournament of Historic Baseball coming up. And we've got the teams from all parts of the country will be visiting us, playing baseball as it was truly intended to be played by the rules of 1867. And what we want to do with this video is kind of look at baseball post 1867 and kind of venturing us into, well, how did this World Tournament come to be, as we're looking at now more than 2 decades of baseball that we have done from this standpoint of the tournament here. We wanted to kind of take a look back on our roots, but also baseball's roots as well. And so we've talked about it before. You know, we hit baseball in 1867 a lot during our games, and with our Facebook page, with our Instagram page, we do a lot with 1867, but we don't really talk about baseball after 1867. Marcus, what does baseball look like after 1867? How is it changing? What's evolving? How does this game look once the 67 season closes?
Well, we've been fighting. The baseball, the National Association, baseball players. They've been fighting around the idea of professionalism and what that's going to look like, and so especially in the 1850s in New York, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Boston, and then moving west towards Detroit, people would come out to see an amateur game, to see the Detroit Baseball Club play the Peninsulars. To see the amateur games. There would be several thousand people who would come out for that contest. But the push for professionalism was strong. In 1869, the National Association allowed there to be salaried clubs. 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was formed as the first professional league. The National Association, which was essentially the amateurs at that point, didn't last much longer. And certainly amateur baseball continued to be played as it is today, but it wasn't the dominant draw the way that it had been. And especially as professionalism spread over the next decade, 15 years, what people turned out to see was the professional game. Excuse me. Of course, in Detroit, that especially showed in the 1880s with the Detroit Wolverines in the National League in the early 1880s, and then who won the National League championship, and then what was even then referred to as the World Series over the St. Louis Browns in 1887. And that was what people were turning out for. What was primarily reported in the papers, especially nationally, was the professional game. And so it went in a lot of ways from being a thing that was played by lots of people seriously to being something that was played by lots of people a bit less seriously and watched by lots of people seriously. The song we sing at the seventh inning stretch, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," that song was written in the early 1900s. The verses of that song are both about a woman who was absolutely passionate about baseball, and so we developed terms like cranks in the 1880s and 90s. Cranks were people who were fanatical, who were crazy about baseball, not just interested, but over the top. And so baseball became really popular. The professional game took over at that point.
So the game itself would you consider the game growing at that point?
Growing, yes, that it was growing in the sense that more and more people were aware of it, and probably knew how it was played, and probably played some themselves. It was still played. I mean, it was played by amateur clubs. It was played in school. It was played with, you can find some fairly old variations of the kind of games we played when we were kids with ghost runners and, those kind of things when you didn't have enough players. They still played variations of bat and ball that were closer to New York rules baseball. So it was certainly growing. It was well understood. It was seen as the national pastime. That term came into being even in the 1860s and just became more widely adopted. So yeah, baseball was well known. But again, it was at the peak. It was especially the professional league, the National League, and then the professional leagues with the creation of various other competitor leagues.
So it's one of these places where that's really growing, or where they were hoping to really get it growing, was Detroit. And we've talked about this world tournament that the city of Detroit is hosting, or the Detroit Baseball Club is hosting here. Tell me what's going on with the Detroit Baseball Club post World Tournament.
Well, they continued to play. They continued to be respected, and to some extent, they were relatively a little bit older than some of the other clubs, maybe a little bit more established. As suggested by the fact that they had most of their practices during what would, for most people, be the workday. But they didn't hold the. In the early part of the 1860s, they were really very influential in Detroit, Michigan, in Detroit baseball, Michigan baseball, kind of in the Midwest. And that didn't really continue. I'm honestly not sure how long the club continued as a club, but they didn't have that same standing. Now, the name the Detroit Baseball Club got picked up later by others, but the club that was responsible for the 1867 tournament, they continued for a while, but more they shifted, as many baseball clubs did. They shifted more towards the social aspects of being a baseball club rather than baseball being the predominant thing. Very much what the Knickerbockers did, what the Eckfords did as well.
So the World Tournament in 1867, I guess one could argue, didn't really have the effect that they were hoping, which was really to escalate them as this main focal point of baseball of the Midwest, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I honestly think it couldn't have. Even if everything had gone well, the fact that amateur baseball was really on the decline. Even while professionalism was by law outlawed, at least by rule, it was pretty clear that there were a lot of people being paid. People were jumping from club to club based on what kind of contract or what kind of financial support they could get. And so the idea of that amateur club, I'm not sure that you could have had a single event in 1867 for amateur baseball that would have raised somebody up. I mean, the forces of the game were towards professionalism were really against it.
So we've been through, the 1860s. We've seen baseball played in which you could catch a ball on a bounce anywhere for an out. We've seen overrunning first is just like overrunning second or overrunning third, where you could be tagged out. We've seen, distances of, or the sizes of the ball, size of the equipment. A lot of things are changing there. So when the baseball game is recreated in the modern sense, how we reinterpret it, in 1867 there, what are some of the significant rule changes that we're seeing between 1867 and, let's just say, 1903, when we've got an American League and National League there? What's some of the big rule changes that we should look at and go, that's significant?
Well, the two that really are interrelated are pitching going from being the true pitch. The word pitch meant an underhanded straight arm delivery, And the rules changing to allow the pitcher to go, sidearm below the waist, sidearm below the belt, sidearm below the shoulder, and then in 1884 in the National League, 85 for the American Association, allowing full overhand pitching. So that was, pitching was becoming faster and faster. You could just throw faster overhand. And also as that came along, the shift from 1860s and before 1867, where the striker would say, "I'd like one waist high," and they call for a certain location, with the creation of the high and low strike zone, and then something that approximated the more modern strike zone. Going along with that as well, the number of strikes and balls. For a while, it was 3 balls, the way it is in 1867, but only every third bad pitch was called a ball. And then it just became 9 balls and then 7 balls. And for 1 year, there were 4 strikes allowed. And so they were tinkering with that. All of that was around finding the balance between pitcher and hitter. And that's always that we do that today with the elimination of the shift, finding the balance between pitcher and hitter. And so those rules were changing a lot. The other thing I always find interesting is if you look at a diagram of the field in 1860, like look at a copy of Beatles and see the diagram, it's like, a couple of lines and some bases. Then look at a field in 1885 and it's got all these extra lines designated where people can go and where they can't. There's places for the coachers. What do you call somebody who coaches? You call them a coacher. So the coachers, they had locations where they could be, and places where the players had to be out. The field became much more complex. And then, of course, as we enclosed more fields, you had the issue of what happens when the ball leaves the field. And then do we keep playing with 1 ball? And so there were a lot of those kind of shifts over time. Smaller things, you mentioned overrunning first base, 1871, 1879, the change in the batting order to the modern batting order. So a lot of those kind of things, the creation of the infield fly rule. But really, I think it's mostly about the battle between the pitcher and the hitter.
So I kind of want to so as we kind of start to transition to more of the modern sense here, more of how we think of it here in the year 2024. I want to ask you kind of just real loose here, like, why do you think people today like vintage baseball? We get some really dedicated folks. We get some people that come to every game, and I'm sure every team that's listening in on this, you've got some pretty dedicated spectators out there that come. Why do people like what we do?
I think it's because there is that element of, we talk about gentlemanly, but I think we use that word incorrectly. Many people think gentlemanly means overly deferential and polite, and that's really not what they meant at all. They were absolutely playing hard. They wanted to win. They were looking for advantages. The idea of knowing the rules better than your opponent, that was called playing the points. So it's not that it's this overly deferential kind of game, but it's that you expect people to play honorably. I think about the thing that always comes to mind for me. We were playing in the World Tournament several years ago. The La-Di-Das were in the final. One of our alumni, Ernie Tiny Ritterhouse, who we've actually named our internal sportsmanship award for, he was playing first base, and there was a play at first, and the umpire called the striker out at first, and Ernie said, no, my foot came off the bag as I reached for the ball. My foot wasn't on the base. He shouldn't be out. He should be on the base. And that was in the championship game. Mm-hmm. And so seeing people play hard, they really, really want to win and do well, but also play honorably, I think is very appealing. the idea of catching the ball barehanded, I hear about that when I'm announcing all the time. People saying, how could that happen? You see a high fly into center field or a line shot into left field, and somebody just pulls that ball in. And people are amazed by that. So I think that there's an element of the game that is it's appealing for its honor, it's appealing for its athleticism, and I sometimes joke, but they, in Pavarelli's guide from the late 1860s, he has this whole section about how cricket is really slow. But baseball, that's an American game. It's very fast. It's a game of constant action. And there's no fix my batting gloves and step out. I mean, it's a game that moves. So people can come and watch a really exciting game played in, an hour and 45 minutes, 2 hours, and see a lot of runs scored. And I think it's just really appealing and know that the people out there are just out there because they love it.
I agree. Like this. The skill that it does take, I always tell people sometimes you have to unlearn how you've always been taught how to catch a ball, and then you've got to relearn how to catch a fly ball, or to say like, I could have done that, I could have done that, and then to watch an outfielder run a ball down and catch it while on the move, to say like, yeah, but that one was tough. Like that takes some skill to be able to do, especially with like when we see like on professional days where, the rare instance where a professional baseball player catches the ball barehanded and everybody goes, oh, wow, that's amazing. And everybody in the vintage baseball community looks at it and goes,
Right.
I've seen that before. And so that's what I want to get into next is, how have we seen it before, specifically here at the Henry Ford? So it's the early 1990s. Where do the La-Di-Das come from? How did they all of a sudden go from, this a real team, but this kind of obscure team, to one of the most recognizable teams in Michigan?
Well, so there are certainly others who can talk about those early days of the La-Di-Das better than I can. But essentially, my understanding is that at Greenfield Village, in what we call the Village Green, there is a store called the J.R. Jones General Store that was moved there from Waterford. And of course, a place like the Henry Ford, they're going to do research on any building they acquire and anything they have. And one of the things they discovered was that Jones, of the J.R. Jones General Store, sponsored a baseball club in the 1880s called the La-Di-Das of Waterford. And there's not a lot of information about the La-Di-Das other than that Jones sponsored them. We do know from some of the newspaper accounts that red was their color. And so when the La-Di-Das were created, they used red as the dominant color and essentially created an 1880s style uniform, which is the uniform many people might be familiar with 3/4 sleeves and knickers and a necktie. But then the La-Di-Das were playing originally 1860 and then later 1867 baseball, but in an 1880s uniform. So recently the La-Di-Das have changed their uniform to be more appropriate to the mid-1860s era. But when Henry Ford decided to really do vintage baseball, it was all around the idea of innovation that the Henry Ford emphasizes, and part of the innovation in gaming that was happening in the United States, and how baseball became so dominant from a community game of different types of bat and ball games into the game we know. And so they had seen the Ohio Village Muffins playing, and the Ohio Village Muffins had seen some folks in New York at Old Bethpage Restoration playing baseball. And so we sort of learned of that idea then and built on it. And then we have such a wonderful venue at Walnut Grove that it's a pretty appealing place to play.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in Michigan that really compares to Greenfield Village as far as scope goes, as far as the depth of research goes. We're always trying to, we see ourselves really as kind of the holders of vintage baseball in our states, and we find the way that we go, a lot of other teams seem to follow suit with that. And that in turn kind of makes, the World Tournament such a noted piece of the vintage baseball community here. So how did that tournament, our tournament here, how did that come back to be in 2003? And what are some things, some of the objects that we have found that really helped to facilitate that?
Again, I began playing in 2004. So there's certainly other people who can talk about this better than I can, but prior to 2003, the la-di-das were kind of an occasional component of the experience at Greenfield Village, and they certainly weren't playing every week. And it was in 2003 that the village decided to really emphasize the baseball program. They created a second team, the National Baseball Club, that was originally out of Parma, Michigan, and created a program that was playing every Saturday and Sunday throughout the summer. And so by really putting that emphasis on the baseball program, that grew it in a lot of ways. They made the decision to focus on 1867 specifically in order to recreate the World's Baseball Tournament that the Detroit Baseball Club held in 1867. And so that led to the acquisition of Haney's Baseball Book of Reference for 1867 and the republication of that book as a guide that we used but made available. It was republished to another publisher to be available in a lot of different ways. So there were a lot of things that came together as the Henry Ford was trying to emphasize baseball as part of its programming. So we do have things like an original 1867 Haney's and several other really interesting baseball artifacts. My favorite one, I think, that many people would say as well is we've always known that the trophy from the original 1867 tournament was a rosewood trophy bat. It had 7 plaques on it. It had a gold leaf on the head and on the butt of the bat. So we've always known that. That was awarded to McCord, the captain of the Unknown Baseball Club of Jackson. But that was in the newspaper. We knew that. Of course, that was a long time ago. And then I'm not sure what year it was, but a few years into our tournament, the village received an email from a woman in California that essentially said, I'm up late at night. I can't sleep. I'm Googling the way you do in the middle of the night. And my husband's family has this bat. And it has a plaque on it that says, Unknown Baseball Club, World's Baseball Tournament, Detroit, Michigan, 1867. Do you all know anything about that? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And so the Henry Ford acquired that bat. Now, what's interesting about it is that the plaque that was on the bat was not one of the original plaques. My guess is, and I don't know this, but this is just my guess, there were 7 plaques on the bat, and there was gold leaf on the head and the butt, and then there was the bat itself. I think they probably took those plaques off and gave them to the members of the club and that gold leaf, and then they gave the bat to one person, the pitcher on the club, and he gave the bat to another person that was in the family of the woman who had the bat and brought it back. So the plaque that was on it indicated that the Unknown Club had given this bat to that person as the trophy of the tournament. So we don't have all of those original plaques, but we have that original bat, and just the idea that this is really our history. It's the actual object that was awarded, and it's kind of a powerful thing to see. It's always on display at the tournament each year.
This is one of the cooler things that I think Jim Johnson has really contributed to. Jim Johnson's essentially our curator and is really in charge of putting together a lot of the vignettes. And for anybody who's ever been, you may notice a tent that's down the first baseline at Walnut Grove #1, and it is essentially a recreation / reinterpretation of the prizes that are awarded, including the bat. But there are tea sets, and there are recreated $300 bills from that time period here. So it's a really cool setup, and the World Tournament isn't just good baseball, which it is. That's probably the biggest reason to go. But you also get a lot of what the actual World Tournament would have been here. So Marcus, you said 04 was your first year. That 2004 was a very soggy World Tournament for those of us that remember it.
It was rained out.
It was totally rained out here. And so thinking back then, instead to say 2005, which was my first World Tournament here and going forward here, what does the tournament, our tournament look like, at that point? And how is the tournament kind of evolved with the sake of historical accuracy in mind?
It's a great question. There's a lot of things that we get right. We try to get the rules right. We work really hard to make sure that we're getting those things accurate. There are some modifications that we make to the rules that are common among vintage baseball. But certainly over the time of the tournament, things have changed. We used to have 3 fields. Now we have 2, which necessitated a move to a smaller field of competitors from 16 teams down to 12. So it's not as big an event as it once was, but there are things that we have tried to emphasize in the rules. We have announcers to help explain things that are happening for spectators who come when they see something that looks a little unusual. I think one of the pieces is that the tournament at Greenfield Village is a tournament. That if you look across the country in vintage baseball, there are some really wonderful events that are really more festivals, and they're characterized maybe by people jumping and playing with different clubs and just sort of enjoying that baseball environment. And I really love to go to those. At Greenfield Village, the World Tournament is a tournament. It's highly competitive. Clubs are really there, and so that they're there to play hard and to win. And so you don't have people jumping from team to team. It's intended to be a pretty strong tournament, and that does affect the way that clubs are selected and the way that the game is played and the umpires and how they're trained and developed to try to make sure that we present that as good as possible. But it is a very well played competitive tournament.
You do get a lot of just good baseball. It was really, really good baseball. I think back to 2007, I think the final score was 33-23. And then to look, maybe last year or even in, the past several years, and if a team gets more than 15 runs, that's considered something of a blowout. It's usually a close game from start to finish,
Right.
whichever teams are in it. So, Marcus, you and we've played in a lot of world tournaments I think for all of the different incarnations. I know I've played for each of the 4 teams that the Village has had at some point here. What are some of your favorite memories from playing in the World Tournament, or announcing, or in anything, but maybe mostly just playing?
I would mention 2. The first one was the moment that the trophy bat was sort of revealed. They did kind of a presentation where they had all the players together, and the curator was telling the story about the original bat. And in my memory, at least, is as he was talking, he was kind of very casually pulling on these white gloves, and he was talking about the trophy bat, and he reached under the table and said, "This bat." And the players were just sort of blown away that object, that actual trophy from that era is right there. And it was kind of a really great historic connection moment. I think my other favorite would be, for a few years, we were fortunate enough to have Ernie Harwell come and call a few innings of different games. And at one point it worked out that I was captaining one of the clubs, and it worked out that we were going to be playing in one of the games he was calling. And I knew that he only called a couple innings per game. He was fairly old at that point. Normally, knowing my ability, I batted myself fairly low down in the lineup. But on that game, I said, okay, I'm claiming some privilege, and I batted myself second just to make sure that I came up while he was calling it. And I would bat with the old split grip style with the hands apart. So I came up to bat and I had my hands like this, and I heard Ernie Harwell, Hall of Fame broadcaster Ernie Harwell, say, "Now, Captain Razorback here, he's batting with the split grip style that reminds me of the great Ty Cobb." And I thought Ernie Harwell just said that I remind him of Ty Cobb. And then I thought I better get a hit. So I flared one over the second baseman's head. And so Ernie Harwell said I remind him of Ty Cobb right before I got a hit. So I love those things, but also just the competitiveness. And then at the end of a really competitive game, seeing the camaraderie afterwards and we always have all the players come down onto the field for the awards, and just watching all the players come down and them shaking hands and being with each other every year. That's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, I love that part too. I intentionally stay in uniform until that point, whatever our result may be, because to me, like it is a little bit of that kind of represents this is the end of summer. We still have games for the next 3 weeks or so, but for one part of me, like when the World Tournament happens, like, well, now I got to go back to school in a few weeks, and that's kind of a sticking point. My big memory I always remember is the first World Championship for the La-Di-Das in 2007. That whole tournament, when we beat the Clodbusters, who had won the first three championships, and then to beat Spiegel Grove, to be able to do that, and just the way that all four teams, because we had so many players that wanted to play in the World Tournament that we had 4 teams that were actually a part of it here. And I know a lot of we get guff about all the we don't get enough changeover. There's not enough new teams there. When we switched from 16 to 12, 2 Greenfield Village teams were killed off. And so we always kind of have a little bit of a surplus of players that want to play that just don't make the cut here. But I remember like every player in a uniform that was just down there with us. Like it wasn't just the La-Di-Das. It was the entire Henry Ford's baseball program that was out there, that we played each other hard all year long, that got us to this point here. So Marcus, let me wrap it up here. Let me wrap it up with this last one here. And that's, what do you look forward to each year as a player, as an announcer, as a researcher, when World Tournament comes a knocking? What's the part that you're most excited about?
Well, there's a few things. Partly it's just as a person, it's seeing people I really like, clubs that I haven't seen and players I haven't seen for a while, and so just knowing that these are often people I might not encounter in any other setting, and so I just enjoy having that group of people. And even if it's people I don't know, I know that they're here because of their love for baseball. I always enjoy that. I am not a morning person, so I don't enjoy umpiring the 8 a.m. game. But just seeing people out there ready to play ball at 8 a.m., I like that. That's a good feeling. And then I announce and umpire much, much more than I play now. And so just getting to talk to people who've never seen this before, and are just fascinated and enthralled by it, and getting to tell them for the first time about what baseball was like in the 1860s and in Detroit in that era. I enjoy that at every point.
It is a fun weekend, and we're very fortunate within the Henry Ford that we always have a big audience, whether it be World Tournament weekend or any weekend, and the amount of people that come in and say, "Yeah, this is our first time. This is amazing. Like, how do you guys do this? Doesn't that hurt? How do you able to swing a bat this heavy?" Et cetera, et cetera. So, especially at World Tournament time, the size of the crowds that we get. I mean, the hill that on down the left field line, down the third base line on Walnut Grove #1, to see that hill packed. I mean, that's like normally we can kind of walk up and down the hill and all, when it is packed, and that's always a great feeling, especially to make a play and to make a catch, especially for you at the Ernie Harwell game. That was always a busy game, but just a routine base hit or catching a normal fly ball, or you as the catcher to be able to make that really good, foul ball grab, and then to hear the reaction. Like, I'm kind of in awe of, like, what are you cheering for me for? I'm just a teacher. I'm just a, normal, regular guy that's going to have a 9-to-5 job tomorrow. But to a lot of these people in the crowd, like, that's not what they see. They see a guy in a baseball uniform playing baseball. So, Marcus, we appreciate your time. We're gearing up here. We're getting ready for the World Tournament. I hope for all of us listening here that you learned a little bit, you caught something up. We don't know exactly how many of these videos we're going to do, but as long as there's interest and there's people that have questions or things come up during the course of games, if we've got the time and we've got the energy, we'll certainly put something into it. But
absolutely.
So thank you, Marcus, and thank you all for listening. And we look forward to seeing you all as early as we possibly can on World Tournament coming up this weekend. Thanks, everybody.